Plain Truth, the show where we get into some of the mysteries, anomalies, and the dirty underbelly of the world around us. I'm your host, Paul, and joining us this week, we have Crystal Clark, who writes about reality, reality construction, reality revision, and topics like that. Crystal, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Oh, appreciate it. And along for the ride is my friend Jerry. Jerry, are you there?
Hi, Crystal.
Hello.
Well, Crystal, you write about interesting topics dealing with what reality is, and you have a website, drowninginabsurdity.org, and I really like that title, by the way. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into this topic, writing about reality?
Sure. When I was younger, I became involved somewhat reluctantly in environmentalism, as my family and I were poisoned by a mining company through our groundwater. And years later, I went back and looked at what happened. I had seen an article in a paper here in Las Vegas, which I had moved to Las Vegas after I graduated high school, and I'd seen an article here about how this mining company was being sued by other cities for contaminating the surface and groundwater. So at that point, I contacted the EPA and the CDC because I understood what the problem was, what had made us ill, and of course I got the runaround. So I was, I think, 19 at the time. My adult life was really just beginning, and I ended up getting caught up in the corporate paradigm. And it wasn't until about 10 years ago that I decided to leave the corporate world because I just couldn't deal with the corruption. I even switched careers. And then I went back to environmentalism, somewhat looking at how much worse were things and why. And around this same time period, I became very, very concerned about the environment, with the water especially, because it was so much worse. And I began focusing my thoughts before I would sleep as to, what can we do about this? And over, it was about a 9-month period, I started to, I used to say get information in my dreams, but I think the more accurate term is I was accessing information in my dreams. And during this 9-month period, there were two very important things that I learned. The first one being that the previous 6 self-destruction episodes were precisely that. Our previous lineages were not cyclical, they were not externally caused, they were self-caused. And the other very important thing I learned is that this is done through the weaponization of intelligent design. So that's what I ultimately started writing about years ago. I took the first book off the market a couple of years ago to revise it and update it. And really what I've been doing all of these years is trying to find a way of explaining it that can reach people the way it needs to. Because not only are we repeating all of the same mistakes for all of the same reasons, we are nearing the end of that road. And we have very little time to turn this around. So writing about reality revisionism, the way I have been recently, is a recent way of trying to communicate the same problem over again. And people really like it. It's something that they can get in touch with and they can see working around them. So that's really how this began, although there was an article that I wrote in 2012 that is still on the website, called The Winners Write Reality. And this is about how the winners don't just write and rewrite reality, but they also do it with history as well. And that's what we often hear, right? The winners write history, but they're really writing reality in the process. And there was a wonderful little phrase that I heard some time ago. It was a little Facebook meme going around that's basically said that if you don't know what a globalist is, you don't know jack shit about politics. And I can't even begin to express how important that really is, because it is the globalist mindset that is behind reality revisionism. It is the methodology through which they hope to obtain and solidify their power. And they are fanatical. They are fanatical in every sense of the word, in that they are loyal to the cause beyond reason. And this is the exact same thing that has happened before. several times. I personally, in my own research, came across references to 6 different lineages in which this has happened. And I think this is the 7th. I've got a friend and colleague who I met a couple of years ago who talks about the same kinds of things, and he's also convinced it's the 7th, and I think he's right. So really, this is why I talk about the things that I talk about. Is it's my goal to help people see and identify the patterns that lead to an entire civilization's demise.
Well, that's a lot to chew on.
Yeah.
That's a big topic.
Yeah.
So we could approach this in a lot of ways, but first, I guess one question I have is, do you consider the fall of Atlantis to be the last cycle?
I don't have an answer to that, and I don't think that we're going to have an answer to those kinds of questions until we deal with the problem that we have during this civilization. And of course, we can get into that as we move through what reality revisionism is and what it does and what it's for. And it's affecting literally every aspect of our lives. But before I do that, before we jump right into reality revisionism, I do want to lay out the path of the destruction of an entire civilization. It happens in 3 phases. And
Okay, sure. Go for it.
so I'll just go through these very quickly. And then as we talk about reality revisionism, folks will see this working in this order. So there are 3 phases. The first phase is survivable as a whole. And by that I mean that a whole planetary civilization can survive this phase. As long as it doesn't progress to the next 2 phases. And this is the birth of elitism, both narcissistic and psychopathic forms. This begins the first division or compartmentalization and disconnection of humanity into 2 main groups or subdivisions. And when this happens, we have 2 groups of people that are no longer working together towards the same evolutionary goals. And this begins very, very early on in a civilization. So think way, way, way back. But even today, this is the beginning of what people are now terming a breakaway civilization. This is where it starts. And even though this is immoral and it's inequitable, it's still survivable. But as this continues, if it isn't stopped and dealt with in a civilization, then it moves to the domination phase. And this is an extension and progression of elitism. This begins control over others. We see the dichotomy expression through wealth, knowledge, and privilege versus poverty, lack, and ignorance, freedom versus slavery. We get the appointed divine right of kingship, monarchies and dictators versus serfdom and feudalism, the corruption of justice, where you have just us versus what you and I are supposed to consider justice. And this also begins the progression and more widespread war. You get regional wars and alliances that become more prominent to secure and consolidate more wealth, power, and natural resources. And today, of course, this includes technological resources. So that's the first phase. The second phase, which is not survivable long term, this is not an exact science, but I would approximate it at 100 to 200 years. And this is the commingling of elitism with advanced scientific knowledge. This accelerates planetary-wide destruction through the increased perpetuation of ignorance to stifle resistance, expansion of global wars for greater control of natural resources in conjunction with accelerated alterations, violations, and weaponization of natural laws on a global scale. This manifests the beginning stages of global genocide by turning nature in on itself, restricting public access to advanced cures, medical techniques, and significant non-polluting energy-producing technologies. That's phase 2. Phase 3 is not survivable short term, and we are not only in phase 3, but we are well into phase 3. And phase 3 is the manipulation of the global population into participating in their own demise out of ignorance. This accelerates things because now these people are not just working towards an agenda that isn't being, but you have the general public participating in it. So this starts a spin cycle where things begin to move very, very quickly, and this is the phase that we are in now.
Okay. And so the reason we're in the extinction, the coming extinction now, is because of those technical reasons. They've technologically got there, and they've gotten the public to participate in its own demise.
Yeah, so these are the two primary factors of how it begins and ultimately ends. Because once you get the public participating in their own demise, once this happens, things accelerate, and of course, and everything accelerates, including the propaganda, the lies, the revisionism that we're going to talk about, because people are duped into participating in their own demise. Their goodness is used against them, and they are duped by false pretenses. So they think that they're doing the right thing. I mean, I really do believe that most people are good people and would do the right thing if they knew what it was. And I don't think that I'm the only one who feels that way. Otherwise, we wouldn't have so much psychological manipulation, emotional manipulation, which is the perception management and social engineering, and on and on and on. You have to dupe people because they really do want to do the right thing. So this begins the reality revisionism phase that I'm currently working with to try to reach people and teach them the methodology, because it doesn't really matter what we're talking about. It doesn't matter if we're talking about intelligent design or the way that we've learned everything we know. Pattern recognition is the way you get there. You and I know what an A, the letter A, or the number 1, or a duck, or a cloud. We know what those are because we recognize the patterns. And this used to be the way that we would teach our young. We would give them the knowledge that they needed to mine. Data mining is very, very important, not just for the NSA, but for the individual, because this is what we do. This is what critical thinking is. You look at all of this data. With our young, we used to say, okay, here's all the data. Now solve this problem with this data, or answer this question with this data. And then the mind would start going through all of the data and mining the data and looking for an answer. We don't have that anymore. This is also why they don't teach intelligent design anymore, which really is another show, so I don't want to get into that too much. But when you're trying to revise reality, there are competing realities. And you and I are competing realities because we know I'm sorry.
Well, I guess I have a couple of questions here, but that we might take now before we go too far into this,
Okay.
if that's okay.
Sure.
One question would be, from the perspective of the elite, don't they see that this is leading to extinction? In other words, from their point of view, aren't they about to lose everything? So why are they going this way from their point
Yes.
of view?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think more people should ask it. And I believe that in the past 6 lineages, there were people who asked those exact same questions. And I think this is one of the reasons that we do not see the texts that are in these archaeological finds, because the reason I say this is because once I realized how far down the road we were, when I began writing my first book, I thought to myself, I wasn't sure if this would be the last chance we get. So I thought to myself, now is a very good time to begin leaving records behind. And I attempted to, but what I found out in doing that really changed the way I wrote both of my books, because I recognized in doing it that the more detailed you make it, if you explain the patterns, what happens is you begin to wonder, if the wrong people find this first, have I left a warning or have I left a playbook, a how-to guide? And I personally believe this has a great deal to do with why we are not shown what is in these archaeological finds, because I believe that this has a lot to do with how we got where we are so quickly.
You mean technologically or something?
Really the entire thing. And this is the thing. When you're dealing with this kind of arrogance and psychopathy,
Mm-hmm.
they believe that because they know how their predecessors fail, that they can do it right this time, that they can find a way around it, that they'll finally find the loophole. But it just
Well, they are
doesn't work that way.
criminals who need good lawyers, Right? They are looking for loopholes, right?
Yeah, well, actually, this is the thing. I mean, they write the loopholes through which they get out of so very many things. Uh, they've scripted it. That's where they come from, and that's why they were written into the system so that they could get out of it.
Hmm. Yes,
So
indeed.
that's the other issue.
I've got a question, Crystal.
Sure.
To me, it doesn't seem like this conspiracy seems to be multi-generational, and
Yes,
from
that's
my
right.
perspective, it doesn't seem like humanity usually thinks in that type of time frame. And I was just wondering, do you think there's some type of like archonic connection or something like that? I mean, do you think it's entirely a human conspiracy?
I do, and I see humans at the head of it every day. We know who most of them are. I've written about them in essays, they're in videos. We've got copies of them talking about how they plan to institute what they call the fourth world, which has consumed all of the others. It will be the only world left. Native Americans refer to this as the lostness of the mind. This is all coming from fanatical eugenic globalists. And a lot of people view this as the destruction of Rome, but in fact, it is the rebuilding of Rome. And Roman law, which a lot of people once believed was constructed to protect the privileged. And I would say that's a very good guess. I wasn't there, I don't know, but we are definitely returning to it. I see the Roman pantheon. The archetypes in their methodology, including Janus, the two-faced god of endings and beginnings. Their methodology includes order out of chaos, building their new world on the ashes of the old one. So it's very methodical, but you have to remember that when this started, which I discussed in a previous show recently, I've not written about it in an essay because I more or less assume that most people know this, but the first Rothschild and his story is where a lot of this began. And it was a reality revision then that began a lot of this in terms of acquiring wealth under false pretenses with the false information about the Battle of Waterloo. So, and then the story goes on to define 12 other cohorts he found that were also seeking world domination, and that they were going to do it through the banking system, and that there was a previous example of how they knew that this would work that had already happened. I don't have it. I can't think of it right now, but it was in the other show. But so I really just want to go through the patterns of all of this, and there is a great deal of cognitive dissonance on their part, and by that I'm talking about these fanatical eugenic globalists. There genuinely is. But the first thing that happens is, and we know this from history, when a civilization is conquered, their books are burned. The new management burns their books and their historical texts and begins to erase cultural footprints from the collective memory. And this is reality revisionism. This is what they're doing. And I think what we all really need to start asking ourselves is, are we already a conquered people and don't know it? Because this is happening in every aspect of our society, and not just intellectually, but also biologically. This is where transhumanism comes in. All of these things, this is the nexus. It is this mindset that is the nexus for everything going on that's so tragic today. So once this happens, we right now have an officially sanctioned view of reality that has been predefined for us, and we are therefore allowed to operate within it. This is a predefined perimeter. It's the box of allowable thoughts and behaviors. Now, we've seen this pattern over and over again as well. It's enforced. It's been enforced throughout the ages with subtle psychological manipulation as well as brutal imposition. This is the witch hunts and the Inquisitions, and we are returning to that in its digital form, which we can come back to. So this is thought crimes, and this is where the thought police come in. The other thing about this is when they start shrinking the box to gain more control, this box holds people. and you can only fit so many people into a box, and when it starts shrinking, this is when you have depopulation come in. And this is a very, very common tactic that has also been used throughout the ages, is when the people begin to awaken. War has always been a form of depopulation. It's the same issue. It's a response to an awakening population, because there are more of us than there are of them. What I'm going to discuss next comes from an essay on my website called The Roles of Perception Management and Social Engineering in Reality Revisionism. And this paragraph that I'm going to read to you now explains what reality revisionism is. Reality revisions are agenda-driven and thereby fictitious narratives carefully scripted to revise an entire global reality in order to meet or fulfill that agenda. These are major paradigm shifts of generational proportions that summarily pre- and redefine the future victor and victimhood status of billions. These shifts aren't meant to change the perception and therefore direction of reality for a day, week, or months, but permanently. These revisions are as horrendous as they are gargantuan in sheer size and scope. Their purpose is to forever alter the organic course of the human race in the writer's favors, and with a body count already in the multi-millions will stop at nothing to achieve it. Now, this is where the competing realities come in. And this goes back to what I said in the beginning about the first division of humanity based on an elitist mindset, that this is where it all starts. So unbeknownst to most, we still live in a world in which there are two competing realities that are constantly struggling for full manifestation. One of these realities seeks to wholly dominate and fully replace the other through various methods of suppression and eradication, while the other entirely rejects these notions to the degree of criminal prosecution, and therefore they cannot peacefully coexist ever. This struggle is between the sovereign state, country, or individual owning their own thought, action, and right to self-determination, and a private group of aspiring Caesars and the global governance regime that they hope to create. But in order to do that, in order for the reality that they are trying to install to become fully manifested, it must transfer to itself all of the sovereign power and freedoms of the other. And that's why these two cannot peacefully coexist ever. This is the basis for every war we have ever seen. Every war, whether we're talking about class warfare, biological warfare, weather warfare, literal warfare, this is where it all begins. Now, reality revisions are scripted. They run very much like a script. And again, this is where class warfare begins, because as these people have very arrogantly addressed in their own writings, they have given themselves and only themselves the power to mold and shape the reality narrative so completely that they refer to the rest of us as onlookers and spectators. And if people give this some serious thought, they will find that this is what the three classes that we have are based on. We have the writers, who are the elite. We have the performers, who are the middle class or middle management, and then we have the spectators, which are everyone else. And this is also what the reality box is for. It's to keep people in their place as spectators. That's very, very important. Now, the other issue about this is that pulling off a reality revision is no small feat. So mistakes are made, and this is what we refer to as discontinuity in the storylines. And I like to go back to the Matrix trilogy, where this was so beautifully expressed when Neo saw the black cat walk by twice, and they explained to him, this is the kind of discontinuity that you get when they've changed something, and this is absolutely true, absolutely true. So there are discontinuities in the narrative. Now this is where the use of something that I refer to as lateral narrative binders comes into play, because a real world audience is in the billions, and so operating in this type of a theater is so much more complicated, and that's where these narrative binders come in. They operate beyond the roles of lead and supporting actors, and they operate outside of normal marketing parameters. So their function is to reinforce the narrative while operating subliminally and in the margins. And a really good example of this is the Boston Marathon bombing narrative. before that happened, Nike was marketing a new shoe, and on the posters of the marketers that they were using, the shoe was on a calf that had the flesh blown off. This is a form of lateral narrative binder. Another form of narrative binder. Now this is predictive programming. This is getting people ready for the event before the audience has shown up to the theater, before the audience knows that it's going to happen. This begins to move thought patterns in the direction of the event so that it's easier to sell. That's very important. Another really good example of a lateral narrative binder is polls. This happened recently with the Scottish referendum for independence, which independence is a no-no. It's the competing reality. So of course they were going to rig the election, and a rigged election is a reality revision. But rigging elections all over the globe, that's why it's done. But this is where the polling comes in, because you'll notice that what they're trying to do with these numbers is get the people to believe that they are divided. So when the vote was no for Scotland, Scottish people were very, very upset, but the lateral narrative binders being used to sell it, to bind it together so that people wouldn't question whether or not it was a rigged vote, was the media kept saying over and over again that you've got all of these people here that don't want independence. This is the English, your English countrymen don't want independence. And so this starts infighting. It's the divide and conquer strategy. But in fact, everybody nowadays really has the same view. They know that something's wrong. But here's the thing. They can't get you to believe that the outcome was not revised unless you believe that it was revised by your own people. Otherwise, you're going to look for who really did it, aren't you? So this is part of what lateral narrative binders do. They're the glue between the bricks. They squeeze it, they pull it in really tight so that these discontinuities become imperceptible, and they also form a type of psychic block or psyche block, which we'll get into as we move into Ebola, because they've done the same thing with Ebola. So this particular essay also, it has a list people can go through. It talks about the steps of creating a successful reality revision in the sense of a script. So you have originators, and this is a very important part. You also have funding. The larger the production is, the larger the funding pool you need to draw from, and this is why massive transfers of wealth are precursors to reality revisions. The size of the production is equal to the size of the funding. Okay, and didn't we see $3 trillion go missing right before 9/11? These people are not going to use their own money to fund this. This is where they're getting it. So these go together. You have scriptwriters, managing agents, props and sets. You have lead actors and actresses, and even the terminology, the Middle Eastern war theater, they're using crisis actors. But you also have to have opposing ideologies. And like I said, the first essay goes through this, the way it pertains to 9/11, but we saw this on 9/11, didn't we? The opposing ideologies, Christianity versus Muslims, victims and victors. You've got to have theaters, venues, and showcases, which for most people is television. All forms of mainstream media are the theaters, and you and I are the audience members. And then, of course, these are also the sales force and marketing support centers. Now, this is very important. Sure.
In that article you're talking about, didn't you more or less say that the Iraq War was kind of the beginning of a major change?
Yes, that was a huge, huge reality revision. And reality
Okay, so
revisions...
here's my question. How would that be relative on the scale to the Vietnam War, for example?
Well, we're going to get to that because...
Oh, okay.
Well, actually, I've already stated it, but I know that this is new for a lot of people, so I'll go back to it again. But this goes back to eliminating a competing reality. That's what war is for. That's what it does. So, but before we get to that, I do want to talk about language changes, which is something Orwell was very, very fond of saying, because changes in language can be read as a harbinger of a reality revision coming. This is very important, and this is an example. So in the script, when you're writing a movie script, if you want to later begin to rebrand and redefine the villain, you have to insert the villain first. So the
Okay.
9/11 script with this event, the villain was a terrorist. Okay, it was a Middle Eastern terrorist that hated us for our freedom, which was really the only thing that they ever really told the truth about regarding 9/11, is that we were attacked by people who hate and are threatened by our freedom, and it certainly is not Arabs. So there's that. But once the terrorist narrative was put in place, this enabled the other reality revision of surveillance. Okay, and this is looking for the dissenters and the heretics from the official narrative of reality. They are not looking for terrorists, which is why they never find any. That's not what they're using this for. Okay, this is the new witch hunts. These are the digital witch hunts. That's a big part of it. And so now you see the language begin to change, and this is also in one of these essays. So now it's the non-violent extremist, it's the homegrown terrorist. So once they introduced the villain, they began to rebrand it, and wildly rebrand it, so that it's casting a very, very wide net and including more and more people. And this is what is happening when they said over and over again, you are either with us or against us. This is what they're talking about. These are two competing realities, and if you aren't for it, then you are against it. It has nothing to do with Arabs, with box cutters on planes. This is really absurd. But this is where the pre-crime is coming from, and ironically, another form of rebranding was Obama's drone strike kill list. And that was rebranded to a disposition matrix, and a disposition matrix is your personality profile. That's what they're building. I don't know if you've noticed these little things that are going around on social media. These are little questionnaires that will say something like, what crime did you commit in your past life, or what Native American tribe do you belong to? And people are filling these out and sharing the results. But what I would like people to know is that when you fill these out, you are helping the NSA to compile your disposition matrix, your personality profile. So that's what a lot of this is about. Then we get to the order out of chaos methodology. And this comes from an essay that I wrote called Unsustainable Reality Revisions and the Order Out of Chaos Birth. This is very, very important because, again, we go back to these competing realities cannot peacefully coexist because one wants to wholly consume the other. So when we see, and we've seen this, I mean, this has been in front of our face forever. How many television movies have we seen where there's some demonic or satanic figure standing there triumphantly with a scorched earth in the background? And then we sit there and we wonder at the logic of, well, why would you destroy something that you intended to rule over? But you see, this is precisely the logic. This is the birth of a new civilization built on the ashes of the old one, because one cannot fully manifest as long as the other one still exists. So for what we can glean from this is what you and I view as chaos is their carefully scripted order. And there are ways that they try to cover for this, and one of these is something that I refer to as the incompetence meme. And this is, and we saw this a lot with Ebola, didn't we? Oh, they're so incompetent. The CDC is incompetent. Obama is incompetent. These people are not incompetent, but they need you to believe that they are incompetent because it loops thought patterns away from discovering intent, that it's purposeful, that they are destroying what our world to build their own, basically, is what's happening. So that's very important. This particular essay also discussed the duplicity and hypocrisy of the sustainable development narrative, which is also a reality revision because it's all being manufactured. I should back up a moment here. The Hegelian dialectic, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, is where, or rather the same principle that order out of chaos methodology is also using. They're very, very similar. So they're destroying one thing, and then they rile people up and get people to beg for them to fix it, and then they can install the solution that they always wanted to install but couldn't do it without the prior chaos that they instituted first. So these things go together. The same thing is going on with weather. The same thing happened in Ukraine. All of these countries that are being invaded because they are a competing reality. They didn't have central banks. A lot of people still don't know that. So what happens is these people are not going to go along with the new global order flow. And so the chaos is started from the inside, and then the very carefully scripted order that comes along to fix the chaos that was intentionally caused installs a puppet dictator that will go along with the flow. This is exactly what's happening. And the manufactured lack also, as a side note, although it shouldn't be, this is also part of eliminating the competition. And eliminating the competition is where so many of the really diabolical programs we have running now are coming from. And this includes, I think, the Ebola virus pandemic narrative, vaccines, GMO food, the elimination of Granny, digital reality revisionism, the destruction of books that actually had references to a pre-revised reality in them. That's also happening at the same time. Common Core and dumbing down is happening, but we can go through that a little bit more towards the end.
Okay, so there's again a lot to
let you ask questions. Yeah.
There's a lot to chew on there. So
I've been writing them down as you've been.
Oh, okay.
So.
Good. I'm glad somebody did. Now I'm losing the first three questions. let's say, okay, so basically the reason the Iraq War then is so important is it's kind of, I guess you'd say it's changing the reality of earlier narratives like World War II or something, right? So now we're in this
exactly
new,
right. Yeah.
Okay, so it's just the paradigm we're in now, I guess you would say. And that's a more totalitarian form, at least for the U.S. Okay. These other, I guess you'd say, the destruction of the past. I mean, let me put it this way. In some senses, all of these things have been going on a long time. They're just picking up speed, aren't they?
Well, what I'm ultimately hoping to help people recognize is where they go and why they began. Where did they begin and where do they end? So how long it's been happening is really, to some degree, irrelevant. We know when this particular track started for us. What I'm hoping to help people see is where it ends and how everything currently going on is about this particular issue, and that is the installation of global governance by fanatical eugenics. If that happens, we will not survive it. We are not intended to survive it. And the methods through which they are trying to eliminate us, which is the competition, is the methodology through which civilizations destroy themselves. That's the connection. What anchors pre-revision reality, which is the competing reality? You have to get rid of it. And how many movies and films have we seen over the years where they burn the books? They do it historically. We've seen films like the original Rollerball, Equilibrium. There was another one that I can never remember the name of, but I think it was in the 70s where they had firefighters, but they didn't fight fires. They would actually go
Fahrenheit 451.
That's right. They would go and burn the books. And this is actually already beginning. People are just unaware of it. This is why Google wants to be the information god. And this is why references to Ebola as a parasite were removed before this Ebola virus pandemic narrative began, which I also would like to discuss. And we also have to remember that this is where killing Granny comes in, because the old people, the older generations, are anchors for a pre-revision reality, which is the competition, and they must eliminate it to be successful. So we have old people that remember what it was like before. We have old people that remember that Ebola was a parasitic worm and not a virus. We have old people that remember all of these things. They lived through it. They watched it. They have to be eliminated. At the same time,
You're making me feel old.
Well,
because I remember some of the different lies we were taught.
Yes. I mean, every generation has their own that they go through, because all of these revisions are leading up to the installation of this global governance. That's what it's all for.
Crystal, do you remember when the fear was global cooling? In the early 70s, when they were creating some of the modern environmental movement, that was one of the fears.
That was one of the fears, but I think that was a truer representation of reality than where we are now. When I was writing my first book, it took several years to write, and at the beginning of writing that book, I could Google greenhouse gases, and I would get page after page after page of companies selling carbon injection kits for greenhouse growers because it's plant food. As they began to change the language towards the greenhouse gas effect, which they later rebranded to global warming, excuse me, which they later rebranded again as climate change, and they rebrand it every time people catch on. What I saw happen over the course of a 3 or 4 year period was a search and replace mechanism via which I refer to as digital reality revisionism, in which after a while, if you typed in greenhouse gases, all you would get is Al Gore and his inconvenient truth. That's all that would come up. So this should disturb people. This should disturb people greatly. I'll give you another example of something that, just so I can really make the point on how serious this is. There's a fellow that I am associated with through social media. He's a professional photographer. He's an excellent photographer, but he's also a very active anti-chemtrail activist. And he and a friend of his, he posted the other day on social media that he and a friend of his had went to a local library looking for library books around 1975. And they couldn't find any. The librarian explained that they weren't allowed to carry books on weather for children older than 2 years. And when he inquired why, she said, oh, well, we just need to keep them up to date. And when he asked what they were doing with the old books, she said she thought they were being destroyed. And then he took photos of the new books, and of course these have all of the new clouds that we can thank geoengineering for. And the point that I'm trying to make with this is this is the connection between eliminating the competition, between getting rid of Granny, while at the same time bringing the next generation up on Common Core. Because what they are ultimately hoping to do is, excuse me, completely eliminate pre-revision references. So how would you, as a parent of one of these children, how would you prove to your child that you once lived on a planet that had deep, clear blue skies when there are no references or photos left? How are you going to prove it? You can't. And once you're gone, there won't even be anyone around left to encourage them that something has changed. They won't know. This is what reality revisionism is doing at breakneck speed, and people should be very, very concerned about this.
Okay, I'm totally with you on that. But hopefully this wouldn't be going off too far, but I've got one question that I think we're all going to have. Okay. And that is this really that different? And so what I mean by that is the New World Order crowd, or whatever you want to call them, they've tried to bring in a New World Order in the past, and we had things like the collapse of the Lombard League and various other disasters, followed by the massive die-off in Europe and things like that. And I travel around Asia a fair bit, but even visiting other countries like South America, it looks to me like there's a tremendous growth in the world, particularly Asia, and that the West is just collapsing. It's not that they're going to take over, it's that they're collapsing and their elite have gone nuts and become totally decadent and full of hubris and things like that.
Sure.
And that this regularly happens, and that's how come when civilizations collapse, not extinction collapses, but just normal civilizational collapses, a few Spanish guys on a boat can take over huge areas. Yes, they had, horses, or yes, they had whatever, but really they also came into places that were ready to collapse. And so I guess what I'm asking is, haven't they just gone off the deep end and they're going to collapse?
No. Have they gone off the deep end? Yes, they absolutely have, but it's important that we try to understand the complexities involved and what they're trying to accomplish and how far they've already come.
Mm-hmm.
Destabilizing other countries or their competitors, any competitor, it doesn't matter what it is part of them installing this new form of governance. Okay, it will be the most perverted form of governance this planet has ever seen, ever. I mean, this will be a return to your daughters being taken and being dropped off at one of their parties, running through the woods naked while they're hunting her for entertainment. I mean, yes, they are absolutely insane, but again, they are fanatical and they are insane beyond reason. They don't reason this out in terms of consequence. And I think that most of these people, there are several other issues going on here. First of all, they believe that we are an inferior race of humans. Okay. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance in this, but this is the modus operandi of most of their behavior, okay? And they believe that because we are a lesser race of humans, and when I say we, I'm not talking about the dark races, I'm talking about anybody who isn't them. They are the most racist people on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
That as an inferior race, we have an inherent defect, and that defect is cowardice, and that because of it, we will not challenge them. Now, here's where more complexities come into the equation, and this often reminds me of that beautiful saying, they who have put out the people's eyes reproach them of their blindness. So, and this is the nexus for so many, many things. We are not biologically, genetically two separate species. We do not have an inherent defect, but transhumanism is working to make it true. The dumbing down, the reality revisions are working to make it true, because reality revisionism does not just touch data in terms of books or memories or text. You're talking about people. So as long as there are people who exist, who have the same genetic code, who can have a DNA test done to discover that they are not genetically really any different in the ways that they pretend to be, these people are competing realities just by existing. You see, it's a very, very twisted mindset. It genuinely is. So at the same time, they're dumbing everyone down. People don't have knowledge of design anymore. They don't have it. They purposefully don't have it. And what they like to do, because these people themselves evade intelligent design, they avoid it like the plague because of that interesting caveat. If intelligent design exists, there must be a designer. They are trying to, part of what this new global governance is based on is becoming the designer. But the problem is that when you approach creation with that mindset, you no longer are creating its destruction. So they are decoding how all of this works. I often refer to it as a virtual reality program. Not in the sense that it isn't real and it doesn't matter, because it does matter. But in the sense that creational design, intelligent design, whatever term you want to use, I termed it the sacred science to try to find a neutral term, which is really nearly impossible. But I don't mean this in a religious, airy-fairy way. They are literally decoding how it works. And this is why, if we use a computer analogy, a virus is built by knowing what the source code was and knowing what source code it wants to go in and change. The virus comes in, it goes and it changes the code. The program no longer functions the way it was originally intended to. This is what they do with weather. This is what they've done with vaccines. This is why so many people who have been vaccinated, even young women who are vaccinated with Gardasil, not just African women, are now sterile, because these vaccines, just like a virus, went in, altered their genetic code, and now they don't function the way they were originally designed to. And these types of revisions are happening biologically, atmospherically, environmentally, educationally, and they are being done without our knowledge and consent. This is very, very important. And I see somebody in this in the chat here asked, well, who is they? This is way too complex for me to get into today because we've already chewed up basically the first hour. But a lot of different people have covered this, and as I said in the beginning, where this track for us began, especially in terms of the financial system that was used to consolidate the power of the fanatical globalist eugenic revisionists, began with the first Rothschild. In the essay that I mentioned a moment ago, called Unsustainable Reality Revisions and the Order Out of Chaos Birth, there is an excellent 30-minute video that was produced in 1992, actually, by a man whose last name was Hunt. It's excellent. And what's so excellent about it is it's not conjecture. He has copies of their programs. He holds them up to the camera so they can be read. He has audio recordings of them stating their intentions, stating how they are behind the entire environmental movement, which is another method of reality revisionism. So all of this has been gone over before. There are lots and lots of other people who know this, who these people are, why the Illuminati was started. It was started for this. It's all about this. It's about making this a reality. And by this, I'm talking about this system of global governance. These are fanatics. And we really right now this is how bad it is. We live in a reality in which it's very much like cartoons we used to watch, in which a group of bad guy bank robbers, and they always had the striped shirt on and the masked faces, right? They run into the bank. They run out. The cartoon shows them run out, and they've got their loots of their bags, their loot, and then they run around the corner and they change clothes, and here comes the angry mob and says, "Oh, we heard about what happened. Which way did they go?" And the real criminals point in the other direction, and the mob takes off in the wrong direction. This is the reality that we live in. These are the terrorists. Do you see what I'm saying? And
Oh, sure.
everything that they're doing is for this moment. They want to achieve this system of global governance. It's essential. Even the surveillance that's happening on the internet. I don't know if you've read the book the patent is co-owned by Google and Jared Cohen, The Coming Digital Age. The entire idea of technology, it's always sold as how it's going to benefit people. It's going to lift people up. It's going to create equality for everyone. But if that were really the case, in this book, you wouldn't find them redefining the 3 new classes of the future. So we're not seeing this technology being used to eliminate class warfare, but rather to redefine it based on the new parameters of this global governance. This is what the online IDs are for. They were talking about vetting people, banning them from broadcasting on social media if they are not going to go with the program. And again, this is what surveillance is for. They're not looking for terrorists. They're looking for the dissenters and heretics from the official narrative of reality. That's what it's for.
Crystal?
Yes.
I was just wondering if I could ask you a question. It's sort of, I don't
Sure.
want to go too far off topic.
Sure.
But in regards to predictive programming, a lot of people say that, they have to tell us what they're doing. Do you agree with that? And if so, why do you think that they do that?
No, they don't have to tell us what they're doing. I actually touched on this in one of these previous essays, but they don't have to. But again, they believe that we are a subspecies of man with a defect that won't challenge them. So why would they care? And I have to admit, and I've said this many times publicly during radio shows, I've seen this my entire life. We have a severe cowardice problem on this planet. We absolutely do. But is it a genetic defect? No, of course it isn't. And we also have people that are afraid to do anything about it because they aren't sure what to do. They aren't sure what's wrong. And of course, that's intentional. It's very intentional. But are these people obligated to tell us what they're going to do? Absolutely not. These people don't have any honor. Why would they? I know that some people speculate, well, it's karmic. If they tell you what they're going to do and you don't stand up, well, then you asked for it. But this again is a very good measure of their own cognitive dissonance, because when people do stand up, they murder them. You're not allowed to stand up. even if you have the capacity, and everyone does.
All right, yeah, that's sort of my take was always that it was sort of either a karmic thing or some type of honor type legal aspect within their own elite system. And again, I could be wrong. And when they do supposedly tell people or let you in on the secret, it seems like it's always done in a mocking or a surreptitious way. And what comes to mind, I don't know if you've seen the movie. I think it's Iron Man 3 or something, but they have this fake terrorist guy called the Mandarin. And, you know, it's essentially a caricature of Osama bin Laden. And when I seen that, it's almost like, you know, this is exactly what they did with Osama bin Laden. They're either mocking us or letting the cat out of the bag to mock us.
Yes, it's really, a lot of it is just a mockery, because as I said, you know, if they were really giving you the opportunity to stand up, then why do they murder people who stand up? Why do they go so far out of their way to eliminate the competing reality if they really wanted to give it a chance and believe that they're karmically somehow responsible for doing so?
Well, that's a good point.
Why would they do that? Yeah, these people really are insane. They don't have any honor or ethics or morals to speak of. They don't. They're trying to institute a perverted global paradise. And the other thing, again, there are so many complexities that go along with this, but one of the competing realities to this form of global governance is private property ownership. And this is where Agenda 21 comes in. And again, if you go back to the idea that they have to wholly consume one reality for this one to fully manifest, there's a great speaker on Agenda 21. Her name is Rosa Koire, Koire, whom you can find on, excuse me, on YouTube. And she has said many, many times that it subsumes our individual rights. And that is exactly right, that this is another arm, another byproduct of reality revisionism. And this is the push to make everything digital is also part of this. Because I don't know how old you guys are, and you don't have to say, but really, my generation was the first to grow up with a computer. My stepfather, when I was 9, had a VIC Commodore, and I took computer-aided drafting in high school, and that whole thing. So, you know, I've kind of seen it evolve. And in the beginning, they weren't selling home computers; they were selling workstations that were like $3,000-$4,000. Most people, even in offices, had terminals. These were just monitors that connected. It was a monitor and a keyboard that connected to a server in another room or area of the company, and that's where all the data was held. We are going to return to that, and it's going to.
We already are with the cloud.
Yeah, exactly, that's what I'm getting at. It's going to look a little different, but it's not going to be any different. So what will property ownership look like? Yes, there's Agenda 21, and Agenda 21 is a United Nations program. The United Nations is also part of this, which again is in the previous essay, because Maurice Strong and Edmund de Rothschild were behind the League of Nations, which was created for this moment. Everything they do is for this moment in time, which the United Nations is what we see now. That's the version that we have now. It is a UN program, Agenda 21, that seeks to eliminate private property ownership. Now that's with land and property as it pertains to land. But do we really own something like these computers, for instance, that we have now? Do we really own these if someone can remotely access it without our permission and add or subtract things from it, remotely delete things? There was a couple of years ago, the Kindle version of 1984 was remotely deleted from millions of Kindles without the owner's permission. If your car can be stopped remotely via satellite, do you really own the car? So we're going to be using things that aren't really going to belong to us. We're going to be using them under the guise that we actually own these products. But again, do you really own something if you aren't in control of its content or its actions?
No.
So 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 the end of private property ownership extends to everything. It's not just land and property. That's very important to communicate. Did you guys have some other questions?
Well, I do, but how they'll flow into it. I mean, we wanted to get into Ebola a
Yes.
little bit, but I tell you what, I was, when I hear what you're saying, I kind of, it begs the question of whether you think there will be big wars as part of this, because I'm reminded of an old Soviet joke that goes something like, an optimist is studying Esperanto, a pessimist is studying Chinese, and a realist is practicing with his Kalashnikov. And it kind of begs the question, because you see all around the world that the rest of the world is basically resisting pretty heavily at the moment. And the U.S. seems to be getting more and more militaristic. And so do you have any thoughts? Are we heading into a world war or something like that?
Oh, absolutely. But again, if you just look at the patterns, then you can see what they're all for. Because the only people that are being targeted, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about people like you and me, the only people being targeted are the dissenters and heretics from the official narrative, from the revision, the intended revision. I disagree that a lot of nations on this planet are fighting it. I think that a lot of them have already been conquered and just haven't told their people yet. Are there holdouts? There are, and we systematically go after them in an effort to bring them into the fold. I personally think that I don't know if you listened to Putin's recent speech at Valdai. I was
Sure.
very, very very grateful to hear a world leader talk about how they know and understand how important self-determination is, not just for an individual, but for a sovereign nation, and that he understands that the globalist architecture is in defiance of that. It robs people of that, and it's been a dismal failure. It's the first world leader I've heard say that, and I think that the BRICS countries are working on creating an alternative, because I think that there are world leaders who have sat down and looked at the inevitability of the current path that we're on, and no one survives it. Now, does that mean that the people who are trying to institute this new form of globalism, does it mean that they no, absolutely. These people are homicidal to the point of suicide. Failure is not an option. They would rather it all crash and burn than fail.
What would you say, Crystal, to the people that argue that everything going on between China and Russia and the United States is all just kabuki theater, and also the point that some of them say the United States was meant to be crashed, and essentially they're sort of building up these other countries and simultaneously making the United States look horrible to kind of give us a solution that's preordained. What would you say to that?
Well, again, if you just look at what the intended goal is, and reality revisionism is what gets them there, and it keeps groupthink is loopthink. It runs the mind in circles. Are these narrative binders that we're looking at when they talk about other countries? Are they narratives? I don't know, and I don't know that we will know for some time. I mean, who can say? That's how bad it is right now. I really don't know, but I personally, at the moment, find the BRICS nations a genuine start in a direction that we have to begin to go in if we're going to avoid catastrophe. There has to be an alternative, and is it the best one? Maybe not, but it's an alternative, and I think that's important. But again, you're only going to find people being targeted that are not willingly going to go along with the new program, with this new order. Those who aren't going to do it, you're going to see a war in every case, whether it's an individual or a country or a state. That's what you're going to find.
Yeah.
Well, I think
certainly what we have.
I think we're already there.
Yeah.
That's true, and the United States was an attempt to flee this mindset. So we know that at some point it has to be brought back into the fold, and I think it already has been. And I think that we, at this point, we can consider the United States the military arm of this new order, and we're being used to institute it and install it everywhere else. Yeah, and of course, if you look at treaties, which are also, I think, the corporate charter for this new form of governance. If you look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, what they're basically doing is divvying up the land, the land mass of the planet, to their legates and their legionaries, and determining what purpose these will have in this new order. And it's really very sad, because there are some countries whose only purpose, whose only function to serve is cheap labor. It's really very, very sad.
Well, on the bright side, I think the TPP is basically doomed. I mean, there's no chance at this point.
I really hope that's true. I think that the BRICS nations have a lot to do with that.
Well, in the case of the Pacific or Asia, it's China. These countries do more business with China. They're going to be doing far more business with China in just a few years than they are with the U.S.
Yes, but you have to look at the psychological factor. People didn't think, you see, this goes back to the cowardice issue and things like, the psychological experiments like ox conformity, okay?
Mm-hmm.
You start looking at those things. Nobody wants to be the first one to stick their hand out when they've seen the other 5 people get theirs cut off. They're seeing that there's an alternative. They're seeing that there are countries that are not going to go along to get along anymore, and that really empowers people. And so, again, I'm very pleased to see an alternative and what appears to be intelligent people who understand why it's important behind it.
Here's the problem, though, Crystal. Who shipped all of the industries and factories over to China? It's the same people. It's Maurice Strong and the rest of the psychopaths.
That's right. That's exactly right. And of course, this is the other thing that's so easy to point to in terms of the phony environmentalism movement, right? Because we're being told there's too many of us. We're the mindless breeders, and we're the sheeple that just will consume until there's nothing left. But in fact, if you look at things like planned obsolescence, which is built into products intentionally, the faster those garbage dumps fill up, the faster their pockets fill up. So, and again, also, transfers of wealth are essential, because pulling off a global reality revision, if you consider all of the factors involved, it's a massive, massive production, including the war. You're talking about money for bombs. You're talking about money for mercenaries. You're talking about logistics. You're talking about bribery, payoffs, corruption. It's expensive. The money has to come from somewhere. And people will notice that when they ship these jobs overseas, let's use a shoe, for example. Let's say a $50 shoe was here in the U.S. costing $40 to produce. They move it overseas, and now it costs $1. Did they lower the price? Of course they didn't. So, yeah, there's a level of greed involved that's actually, it's not just a matter of, more isn't enough. It's actually a method of funding for what they're doing. The money has to come from somewhere.
Yeah, I guess my point is basically that, the fact that they moved everything over there would almost indicate that they're, let's say at the higher level, at maybe the highest echelons of the globalists, that they have planned for the United States to collapse from the get-go. Now, yes, underneath them, there may be like a whole hierarchy of lower globalists or elitists or bankers who don't really want that to happen, and maybe there is infighting on that level, but at the highest echelons, from my perspective, it does look like they were certainly intentionally moving the power to China in the East.
Well, this is just shifting pieces, the grand chessboard and all of that, but they're the players and it's their board. Do you see what I'm saying? It's all of these maneuvers are to ultimately solidify their new power structure. That's all it's for. And once they're done, who's going to be left to stand up against them?
Well, I think there's another angle, though, Jerry, in that question. And that is, look at how successful the Cold War was for them. You need an enemy. The enemy has to be believable. So that enemy has to be strong enough, right? And so, I mean, for that matter, right now we may be entering a new Cold War, the West versus Russia and China. And that means military spending. It means control of the people, you know, that kind of thing, right? And push comes to shove, it may mean a big war, which maybe they want, right? If China were weak, none of this would have been feasible.
Well, to me, it just looks like they're sort of framing both sides of the Hegelian dialectic, and I don't know if either the fascism and tyranny of what we're seeing in the West is the actual ultimate end goal or not. Like, it seems to me that that's just kind of something maybe they're framing so that it's going to be so distasteful. You know, we're not going to want to have anything to do with the old values that used to encompass the USA. Everything's going to be sullied.
Could well be. I mean, it's definitely possible. I mean, these are tough questions, but Crystal, on the bright side, I follow Russian news media websites a lot, and I would say that Russia and China, but particularly Russia, are going all over the world, making a tremendous effort to let everybody know about a lot of things.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
Lecturing on how to stop color revolutions, the dangers of these things like the TPP, what they're actually all about. They're making a huge effort because it would cut off their oxygen supply. In other words, from a Russian point of view, they need to have, whatever, South America not join the TPP, that kind of thing.
Yes.
And so they're making a huge effort, and China is too. But China tries to do everything really secretly, whereas Russia's a little bit more open about it. But anyway, I don't think it's like there's one guy on the playing field and he's just getting everything he wants. And then that
Not
of course
anymore.
gets back to what Jerry's saying, that maybe actually the agenda is to have the U.S. collapse. I'm not quite sure, but that's another possibility.
Well, again, I mean, it's not, these are details that are somewhat irrelevant because you have to look at the principles involved. We are a free people, and free people are a competing reality. So yes, they have to collapse our society. I mean, we're already at a point where it's illegal to feed the homeless, yet the poem that's on the foot of our Statue of Liberty says, "Give me your homeless." That's how, I mean, so yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, this is the thing. The way we're going to know if Russia and China are really playing along is whether or not we go to war with Russia and China. And I think that's what the Ukraine and Kiev destabilization is all about. I think they absolutely want a war with Russia because Russia doesn't intend to go along. And that's the way it's always going to be. Anybody that they go after is going to be somebody who is a dissenter and a heretic.
Yeah. I tell you what, why don't we move on to the question of Ebola, because that's a good example of illustrating things. So do you want to tell us your thoughts?
Oh, sure. Before I do that, I don't know if you guys heard me talk about this in a previous show. I actually have an essay on Ebola that I haven't put out yet, but I would like listeners to really think about this because this is an example of how psychic blocks are instituted with repetition and why we have to get out of the mindset that repetition equals facts. Mm-hmm. If people in their mind's eye, they've seen it enough times, if people in their mind's eye will conjure up that image, the image that they have used from day one with Ebola, and if they will go back to their pre-revision knowledge base and let their own mind tell them what they're looking at, they'll know what it is rather than what they've been told repeatedly what it is. And people have seen images of these creatures their entire lives, whether in grade school learning about the life cycle of a fly or as an adult looking at how can I get healthier soil in my garden. What you're looking at is a photo of a worm. It's not a virus. They keep saying it's a virus. Well, the next logical question generally is, well, if there really is an Ebola virus, why are they showing a picture of a worm? Why don't they actually use the virus? And the problem with that is there is no Ebola virus in nature. Ebola is a parasitic worm infection, and these parasites voraciously feed on the organs and connective tissues of their victims, causing very painful and rapid death. Now, I began trying to explain this to people on social media, having foreknowledge that Ebola is a parasite, asking them, go Google an image of a virus and then compare it to the worm and ask yourself why they don't look right, why they aren't the same. And the reason I was reduced to having to do that is I looked for days, I searched the internet for days to find just one pre-revision reference to Ebola as a parasite, and I couldn't find any. There is one that I can give you, not at the moment, but before you post this, I'll give it to you so you can post it with the video if you would like to, but I'm not the one who found it. It was in a discussion group where somebody in another country did a search for the Ebola parasite and found it, and to this day, a month later, it is the only reference I have ever found. So again, we have to ask ourselves, how did we get to a point where you can convince billions of people that Ebola is a virus? And on top of this, and this is where it gets very disturbing, is that we have report after report on television of a vaccine that's coming out for a virus that does not exist. And furthermore, because Ebola is a parasite, it's a worm parasite, you cannot vaccinate against a parasite. So what will really be in the vaccine? And who will be asking these questions if this happens 10 years from now, if something like this happens 10 years from now, and there are no references left, people or otherwise, to a pre-revision reality? How could we prove it? Because I know the first thing somebody is going to say to me is, well, show me the link. The people revising reality know that's the first thing someone is going to say, and so there aren't any left. It's nearly impossible to find. And there are some very interesting changes in the scientific language that happened before this revision. People might find it interesting to know, especially given the zombie meme that's so prolific, is that in the beginning, pre-revision science considered viruses non-living biological contaminants. There were very precise and distinct differences between parasites and viruses. Viruses were considered non-living biological contaminants because they do not require a host to feed for sustenance, and they cannot reproduce themselves using their own parts. Rather, a virus must, very much like a computer virus, hijack the code of a cell and replicate itself. So now you have the cell replicating the virus rather than its, a copy of its own cell. So this was changed, and part of the confusion, if you try to find, you can use the term, you can query the term Ebola parasite, and in the all of the links that you'll get, you'll see that phrase. But then when you inspect the articles upon opening the link, you'll find that it's been replaced with virus. And what makes it worse was a reclassification of viruses as parasites because of subtle changes in the definition. The attachment, the need to be attached for a parasite was removed, and shelter was added. So now we have a definition of parasite that states that anything that uses another living thing for shelter or requires it for sustenance is now a parasite. And this revision includes humans. Now we are parasites, and so again it goes back to this same mindset. It's a very, very twisted mindset. These people are eugenic fanatics, and so at this point we have to really, really heavily consider. When we look at vaccines, we see that people are being sterilized. We see the cognitive damage that's being done. We see the reproductive damage that's being done. And then we see also military contractors are bidding on, in the UK, for example, to control their health program. And here we have Obamacare that was pushed through, and you'll always find that reality revisionism always avoids democratic processes. It doesn't want the scrutiny, it doesn't want the oversight, and it doesn't want people voting on it. This is the way it works. So when we look at this and we see, okay, Common Core is literally teaching children to replace numbers with shapes. So 1,000 is now a cube. So we're going to, and if the parents of children learning Common Core try to teach their children the old way, which is a competing reality, and children use it in school, they're automatically failed. So at some point when the parents die off, we're going to have children that aren't going to know what 1,000 was. They're going to see a cube, okay? This is the kind of dumbing down that's happening, and this is what allows for something like an Ebola pandemic narrative to happen. But so what we really need to ask ourselves is, when people get these vaccines, I don't know if you guys are familiar with FunVax. Do you remember that whole thing where they, and they've admitted that the new battlefield is the enemy's mind, okay? So this is the new battlefield, and they've identified the neural connections that create fundamentalist ideas and people who believe in God, and they were joking around about a vaccine that they called FunVax because it could rewire the brain. This again goes back to transhumanism, because while we are not two separate species of humans, these things can make it true. So are vaccinations that are killing and maiming and disabling people a method of eliminating the competition? I think it certainly fits the criteria. I really do.
Okay. So a few things. First of all, I mean, this is just back to Plato's cave. I mean, people have been imprisoned and dumbed down forever, but it's just now it's becoming scientific. And maybe we had kind of escaped some of the chains in the Middle Ages or something, and now it's coming back. But I got a question about Ebola.
It's being institutionalized, basically.
Sure, but back then, I mean, it was illegal to, teach somebody to read or whatever. You know what I mean? The possession of the Bible was a crime.
That's right. We are returning to that.
Cut off your thumbs if you had a Bible. And the Bible, it wasn't just religious, it was a means of learning to read.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Right, that was the standard around Europe. So there's that. But regarding Ebola, a lot of people have made the argument that our thinking of what a virus is, or even if they only exist, is basically incorrect. And that there aren't really pictures of viruses in a long time. Like the old HIV, they could never come up with an actual picture to show us.
Yes, I've come across this as well, yes.
And with Ebola, the image I've seen all over the place is actually basically the same of the movie Outbreak or something from the 1990s. Like you say, it's basically a worm or something, but it's not. That's right. It's not a quote unquote virus. So the whole thing seems to be a psychological operation. I mean, from top to bottom. And the people, the story about who's getting it and how they're hyping it and all this, it all seems very, very scripted to me. Yes. And I got a story for you, Crystal. Here's something you might not have heard, but you say you have some friends in Japan. During this Ebola hype in Japan, in like one of the two biggest parks in Tokyo, they had a supposed outbreak of dengue fever. Now, it had been really cold, and obviously, dengue fever is a tropical disease. When did this outbreak happen? It happened immediately at the end of a huge anti-government protest, which, of course, is not mentioned in the media anywhere. And think about that. Then they have to close the park down. But it's also, of course, going to scare everybody who went to the thing, right? You went to an anti-government rally, and now that we find out there was an outbreak of dengue fever that day. And the thing is, that park is very far from a port. Now, this makes no sense. A tropical disease in, a temperate climate when it had been cold, and it's not like next to some bananas in a boat. Is that possible? They never had victims' names. It's just all totally contrived. I think it was a total lie. And then they used it as an excuse to spray nasty chemicals in a couple of parks and things like that. The nasty stuff they always like to do. But my point is, it seems like they're becoming shameless with their lying now, and their hoaxes and so on. And that's the feeling I get with this Ebola thing, is they're just now, this is straight out of Hollywood. This whole thing is straight. De Niro and Dustin Hoffman were involved in this or something.
It is very bizarre, but again, going back to how they're hacking design, they're literally, weaponizing design and turning it in on itself. The same thing happened in Florida. I don't remember the timing, but there was an outbreak of dengue fever right after they released GMO mosquitoes that are supposed to vaccinate against it. And of course, this is happening in California. Children that are getting vaccinated for measles are getting an atypical form of it. The same thing is going on with the polio vaccine. And of course, I'm sure you guys are familiar with the story of Dr. Mary's monkey, and on it goes. I mean, this is not science based on design. It's corporate pseudoscience. But the only way they can sell it as real teaching design in school, basically. Otherwise we would know that they're lying, right? You can't con people that know better, so they have to make sure people don't know better. That's the whole point, is the dumbing down is an accessory that they have to pull it off, really. But I would be very, very cautious about the vaccines, because whatever is going to be in these vaccines is not going to be for an Ebola virus, because it doesn't exist in nature.
And then there's the whole question, the story is that Louis Pasteur on his deathbed basically said that Béchamp was correct, that, the germ theory of disease, the idea that everything is out there attacking us, is actually not correct, and that the problems come from within our environment, inside our bodies. That's a whole can of worms, right? But
yeah.
But it is the case that if you send people to some place like Antarctica or whatever, they will get diseases that theoretically should not be possible. They're coming from within them. They're not coming from, southern China making its way around or whatever. So I think we do have to revisit various human diseases and say that they may be coming from our contaminated environments or the stresses on our cells or whatever.
That's exactly right. I'm really glad that you brought that up. That's very, very true. And in fact, a lot of people have said before that we naturally have viruses in our body, and they're doing what they're supposed to do, but we don't succumb to them until we have been environmentally damaged in some way or overstressed, and then the body just can't keep up. And I have actually experienced this myself. When my family and I were poisoned, I got very sick, and I was told it was chronic fatigue syndrome, and oh, by the way, it's Epstein-Barr virus, and everybody has it, but most people just fight it off. So I've personally actually seen this mentality at work. And I think the other issue too is with vaccines is you've constantly heard the CDC try to pawn this autism link off on something they refer to as mitochondrial dysfunction, and yet at no point do they ever try to explain what's causing mitochondrial dysfunction.
Isn't that convenient?
Very convenient, yes.
Well, I guess that was kind of your start into thinking outside the box then. Is that your experience with the illness?
Well, my parents moved a lot when I was a child, and I was kind of always an outsider looking in, and I've always been a pattern person, and having lived so many different places, you just see the same patterns repeat, and you start to ask yourself why and what they mean and what they're for, and I just have a tendency to view reality that way. And I think that patterns are how we find meaningful data. I think that's why the NSA is so pattern crazy, and they data mine everything. And I think that if the average human being wasn't spending their entire day trying to find out how to make a corporation more money, and were instead left to their own devices to self-determine what they do with their time, I think that they would ask more questions. I think they would discover questions that need to be asked that haven't been asked yet. But that's the purpose for the rat race, isn't it? It keeps looping the mind back to something that makes sure the rest of us are living vapid lives.
Well, that's why so many of us wonder if they actually are human at the top. But anyway, they certainly are psychopathic, so there's no question about that.
Yes.
Well, let's see. From Ebola, have you got any thoughts on that we haven't covered so far, or can we move on?
No, I just wanted to make that point that there was reality revisionism in the digital sense and the scientific sense happening prior to the revision attempt. which is why it's nearly impossible to find any anchor or reference to the pre-revised reality of Ebola as a parasite. They've been removed.
And I know from trying to look into it a bit that it's they have done similar things with other scientific stuff, like you're saying, weather.
Yes.
Not just like what's a natural cloud, but with hurricanes, cyclones, things like that, the way they move or the way they look.
That's
Trying
right.
to find old pictures and old weather books is not nearly as easy as you might think.
That's right.
Here in Japan, we've had a large number of typhoons that come in and then just all of a sudden make a 90-degree turn and stuff like that. Totally, totally ridiculous. And on TV, you have the weathermen saying, "I can't explain it. I don't understand." So at least that's good, because in the U.S. they'd probably just say, "Well, and now it's time for sports."
Yeah.
Right. So at least it's a start. But then I think they're gradually replacing the, guys with training or gals with training in meteorology and trying to replace them, with somebody who knows nothing. And that way it's like eventually, like you say, the young people, a 90-degree turn for a typhoon will not be unusual. But definitely I see that. And then there are some people think that with 9/11, even the dictionaries were changed over ground zero.
That's right. Yes.
The idea that it seems they've made a tremendous effort to all of a sudden, ground zero has the definition of the middle point for where a nuclear blast goes off, and whether that's programming, our subconscious and so on. And that certainly may be the case. They immediately rolled out all kinds of memes on 9/11. And that's why I think you could argue that you were saying the Iraq War is kind of the beginning, and I guess I would say 9/11 might be the beginning.
Well, I mean, the beginning
they go together. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the beginning began with the first Rothschild and fractional banking. But you see, each revision builds on the others, and we are literally surrounded by them. It's environmental, it's intellectual, it's biological, it's everything. They're changing everything. And but as we were talking about earlier, there is hope on the horizon. Like the BRICS nations, Russia isn't going to go along to get along. And I think that there have been people on the inside that have been waiting for enough people on the outside to show support that they feel more comfortable coming forward. And I see more of that. So we can kind of work on it from both ends of the spectrum. And there are people doing that. So, we are not toast by any stretch of the imagination, but that is the outcome if we can't get our act together.
Mm-hmm. Well, what are some of the things you see as being kind of optimistic, or, what can we do, that kind of thing?
If this world is going to be saved, the only way to do it is corruption has to end. Corruption has to be dealt with. We can't sit around and just meditate it away. We can't, so-and-so is going to come and fix it. We don't actually have to do anything. We have to hold our oppressors accountable for their actions. We have to hold people accountable for genocide and illegal war and subjugation. That has to stop. It absolutely has to. But again, if you go back to the beginning of it, whether you want to talk about the top of the pyramid, you can go right to the top and put the kibosh on it because it gets pushed down from the top, or you can begin chipping away at it in your local communities and spheres of influence. They are trying to institute Agenda 21 in your local communities. You can get involved in those meetings. They do use mental manipulation techniques like the Delphi technique. Rosa Core covers that and helps people learn how to get around it during these meetings, and there are more people involved in that. Whatever sphere of influence you're in, whether you're a parent, just a mother, a father, a teacher, a doctor, a lawyer, a mechanic, whatever sphere of influence you have, when you see corruption, you have to deal with it. We have to deal with it. And just creating a new alternative and letting these people wander off isn't going to work. They have to be held accountable because they currently have access to the buttons. And every time they push these buttons, more of the design that keeps us alive is destroyed. You know, their hands have to be removed from the buttons.
Well, that kind of begs the question of how. I mean,
Well, this is the corruption issue, right? I mean, why do we have corrupt judges? Why do we have corrupt policemen? Who are they protecting? Ultimately, who are they protecting? They are protecting the people that are working towards this future and those that are helping them to prop it up. And I mean, this is why we see a move towards a society in which the only job you're going to have is working for the government. You know, how convenient is that? So, I mean, look, I've personally testified in front of federal grand juries. I've worked with the FBI on several occasions. I've tried to work with the Secret Service. You know, there are avenues available to us that are part of our legal system for a reason, and I think that people should exhaust them. But that's the issue. People have to show up, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. But I think the other thing, though, is when you talk about grand juries and stuff like that, that it seems to a lot of people as being above, I don't want to say their pay grade, but above their experience, their background. And so it's kind of off-putting. It's much easier to imagine going to a local meeting that's a PTA thing or
Sure.
fighting Agenda 21. That seems much more where they can kind
Yes.
of get active.
And fighting Common Core as well, that's very important. There's an excellent video, which I'll give you a link to. A fellow did a presentation on Common Core, and at the end is a psychologist whose caseload covered 20 different school districts in her area, and she talks about the self-mutilation of honor students and how the younger children are so they hate it so much that their anxiety levels, they're vomiting, they're doing everything they can to get out of it. It's very, very perverted sexually. It's, you know, this is the thing. You know, I know you guys have seen the movie Idiocracy, and this is really we're not just moving in this direction anymore. We're actually halfway there, and we can't, you know, our children are supposed to be the future of the human race, and we can't let this happen to them. It's, you know, it's just not right on so many levels. So yeah, whatever your sphere of influence is, you don't have to be, you know, you don't have to have letters after your name. You don't even have to have a job. If you're working with children, do your best to understand what they're going through and why, and correct the system.
Do you see any hope in, I guess what you would say is, using some of this technology against them, you know, 3D printers? I mean, here we are using the internet. Do you see anything in that we should be encouraging?
Yes, that is a really wonderful, I mean, that is so revolutionary. Not enough people really talk about that. The 3D printing really is a revolution, but again, we have to understand that there are inevitabilities that will happen if we don't address the people that are pushing the buttons. So for now, yes, we can 3D print casts and guns and all kinds of really nifty, helpful things. But that's now. If these people and the corruption that they are responsible for isn't dealt with, again, they are trying to eliminate private property ownership, and they certainly are not going to let you continue to own a device which will allow you to print more devices that at some point will be considered seditious, unsanctioned material. I mean, you get what I'm saying? So there has to be a balance. There always has to be a balance. While we're working on alternatives to their perverted system, the people that are continually trying to invent that system have to be dealt with, because neither version of reality can fully manifest as long as the other one still exists. It's impossible, which is why they cannot peacefully coexist. At some point, one will have to eliminate the other completely, and corruption must go. If we want the kind of future that we know that we all should have, that's the way we get there.
Yes, agreed. And so unfortunately, we've got a tough fight ahead. Crystal, it's been 90 minutes or so we can wrap it up pretty soon. Is there are there any last thoughts you'd like to give? Mention your website again.
Sure. My website is drowninginabsurdity.org, and there are 3 particular articles that cover this, and it's just so much to cover. It really is. So they cover it in much more depth, and one of those is it's called, oh, I'm drawing a blank. Actually, it's a tab. The website is super easy to navigate. All the tabs are on the left, and this particular tab is called Reality. There is another tab called Articles that will have these other 2 articles on reality revisionism in them. It will be super easy to find, but they go over this in a lot more detail. And the ultimate goal of teaching people these patterns is because I recognize that we currently live in a world where people don't have proper knowledge, so they can't say, hey, I know this is true, which is why I know what you're saying isn't true. While they may understand there's something wrong, and they may not know precisely what's right, they have the patterns and the methodology down, they will always know when they're being lied to. And then at that point, once a person knows, they can begin to look for the truth. And it's essential. We cannot have peace without the truth. We can't.
Hey, Crystal, just a final, I just wanted to make a quick thought there in regards to idiocracy, and that was, I think I would take President Camacho over President Bush or President Hillary Clinton any day.
Yes, how sad is that? For our 2016 election, we're looking at the same 2 families again. Really? It's a Bush or a Clinton? Seriously? How did that happen?
I want an Adams family member, but I'm not sure which family, which Adams. But hey, Crystal, before we go, one last thing. Talking about education, I mean, a lot of people put hope in bringing back the trivium and quadrivium. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that's excellent. But again, we're not going to, there has to be that balance. I mean, I can't emphasize that enough. At the same time that you're trying to move back to principles that do have some basis in a moral and equitable landscape, you have to eliminate the competing reality that's trying to remove it, or you're just never going to be able to fully achieve the kind of education that people should have. There's no way at this moment, considering that we have Common Core in place, I mean, to go from the Common Core to the trivium and the quadrivium, we can't get there from here. A lot has to happen in between.
Yeah, that is the problem. Well, I tell you what, Crystal, it's been great having you, and we really do appreciate the work you're doing. And can't say that enough, because this is indeed such a vital fight. In a sense, it's like you're saying, it's a fight to the finish, really. So,
yes. And it's
so
doable.
That's it.
Yeah.
And it is doable. We shouldn't all be super pessimistic here and go get drunk and whatever. That's not the point. Let's go.
I hope not. No.
Well, Jerry, you're in Canada, so it's awfully cold. So,
I need something to keep me warm.
You need something to keep warm, but that's a different issue. Okay, folks, we'll call it a wrap. Thanks, Crystal. We do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Sure, I appreciate it. Thank you.